I'm Steve Denning. I'm thrilled to be the co-host of the very first episode of our new weekly podcast, Creating Value Wins. I'm joining you from Washington, D.C., together with my co-hosts, Doug Kirkpatrick and Hunter Hastings, who are in California, and Hugo Lourenço, who's in Lisbon, Portugal. And the four of us have been collaborating for the last 5 years, exploring some of the most exciting and important developments in how firms are being run. Our goal with this podcast is to share those insights along with the thinking of the world's leading experts with you every week. And today I'm especially excited to welcome our guest, Rita McGrath, professor at Columbia Business School and one of the world's most famous business strategists. In fact, I first met Rita about 20 years ago in 2005 when I was just discovering the remarkable breakthroughs in agile software development. Truly amazing. But what amazed me even more was that Rita had discovered this 10 years earlier and had already written about it long before I got involved in it and 6 years before the Agile Manifesto. And I'm confident that Rita is once again several steps or several miles ahead of the curve. And the revolutionary practices that we saw in agile software development 20 years ago have now spread far beyond software. They're transforming entire organizations, becoming the operating model of the most advanced and profitable companies on the planet in every major market. So welcome, Rita. It's wonderful to have you with us. And I know you're currently working on a new book that addresses a profound shift in strategy. You argue that we're moving from a world where businesses primarily dealt with stable physical products to one dominated by rapidly changing non-material offerings driven by digital technology and AI. You call this shift with a big word, dematerialization. And to succeed in this new environment, you say companies must fundamentally do one thing, recenter their strategy around a core question. What will create the most new value for customers? Could you tell us what this recentering is about and how does it actually work? Rita?
Well, pleasure to be here, Steve, and all of you. It's a real honor to be invited to appear on your podcast. So the concept of strategy historically has been a world with very different boundary conditions than the world that we're seeing now. It involved stable and pretty predictable industry boundaries. The recipe for success was you found an attractive position in an attractive industry, you threw up entry barriers like crazy, and then you giggled to yourself for decades as you enjoyed a sustainable competitive advantage. And, Gillette razors would be a canonical example, right? But increasingly what we're seeing now is services are replacing products. So if you think about music, just as an example, you used to buy sheet music, then you bought CDs, you discovered new music on the thing called the radio. And today you don't really buy anything. You rent music and it flies through the air and it lands on a device. And by the way, there's no such thing as an album anymore, really. An algorithm curates it for you. And it goes by the name of, music to drink coffee by or music to work out with. And so it's a completely dematerialized, very different way of looking at what used to be a product category. So in a situation like that, right, you can't say, oh, I'm in the airplane industry and that's enough. And I want to win against other airplane manufacturers. Today, you need to figure out how to create those stable boundaries so that people in the organization can know what to do. And I would identify 5 centerings that seem to cover most of the territory. The first is center on a mission. So at Novartis, they center on innovative medicines that treat a specific number of disease areas. You could center on a customer type. So Southwest Air in the past centered on flying that replaced driving, and that drove everything else about their business model. You could center on a technology or a specific kind of know-how. So doctors, Fujifilm centering on, we'll produce technology that's valuable wherever it is. So they went from film to cosmetics to medical imaging to all kinds of industries. You could center on a region or a ecosystem. So your goal there is to become an important part of an important sector. So TSMC in Taiwan would be an example of that. Or you could center on removing various kinds of friction. So, why is Facebook so successful? It, easily allows you to find that sixth grade guy from your chess club, which used to be really, really hard. And so I think these different centerings, once you as a leader have determined the center, then so much else becomes easy. Your capital allocation decisions, what people are striving to do, your core goals, becomes very straightforward.
But just one follow-up question. I mean, there are some companies that would appear to have a very centered strategy, but they are having mediocre returns. Everything they are doing is focused on their strategy, but the strategy isn't working. What do they do?
Well, I think that suggests that they haven't really clearly found a center that the organization's aligned around. It's one thing to say you have a center, it's another thing to actually live it. So if I just take the example of Novartis, their CEO must make 6 to 10 videos a day. And he describes his own role as providing the energy for the organization. But what he's really doing is holding the center. He's making sure people understand what we're all about. And there's a whole cultural piece that goes with that. And he describes their culture in 3 words. So we want to be inspired, we want to be curious, we want to be unbossed. And his centering around innovative medicines basically says, instead of just routine manufacturing where the goal is to do as everybody says, I want my people involved in curious, exploratory, new stuff. It's novelty that we're looking at.
I was thinking of a company like Coca-Cola, which is truly about how wonderful Coke is, but they're making half the returns of the S&P 500 average. So in terms of relative performance, they have some challenges. Should they just be satisfied and say, well, that's what Coke can do, and we live with that? Or do they start to say, we should have maybe broader aspirations that we could deliver more value?
I think they could. I mean, if you think about what Coca-Cola historically has represented, it was that moment in satisfaction for a particular kind of customer. And if you go back historically and look at when they were really at the top of their game, it was all about those special moments when that Coke would provide the joy in the moment, the temporary satisfaction, whatever. I mean, I recall I think it was a Diet Coke commercial where back in the 80s, and they had these women peering out the window at this really hunky looking construction worker, and the nudge was, oh, it's a Diet Coke moment. And that was years ahead of its time. But companies can lose their center. I think that's important to note as well, because the world shifts around you, leadership changes. If leaders aren't really keen about holding the center, it can erode and degrade.
All right. I think Doug has a question. Doug, would you like to chip in?
Yeah, Rita, thanks so much for being here. Once a firm has a centered strategy and has landed on that center, they can start thinking about becoming more permissionless and decentralized decision making and push decisions to the edge, where they can start to harvest new ideas and new innovations and implement new things. How might that work in real life? And do you have any examples of that?
Well, you guys at Morningstar would be a fantastic example. There's plenty of examples of companies that do that. So if I think about Airbnb, to use an example that'll be familiar to a lot of people, Brian Chesky talks about being really centered on customers belonging, hosts and guests feeling as though they belong. And they were drifting away from that for a period. They were sort of getting into being kind of a mini real estate organization. And what he did was he brought them right back to it. Now, another interesting thing about this whole centering concept is what I expected to find when I started this research was I expected to find the sort of Lee Iacocca model of leadership, right? So my secret to success is I hire the best people, I hire people smarter than me, and I get out of their way. And that's not what I'm finding at all. These centered organizations have very hands-on leaders. Now, here's the distinction. They're hands-on, they're holding the center, they're very involved. They might have 30, 40, 50 people who are not necessarily direct reports, but who they engage with like for hours every week. And because of that intense involvement, they don't have to tell people what to do. It's not command and control at all, but they're engaged, right? What they're trying to do is make it so clear what we're all about that everybody else knows what to do. And I think at Airbnb, they go as far as to call it shared consciousness.
Fantastic.
Nice.
Thank you.
And Hunter has a follow-up question.
Yeah, so Rita, we were thinking about strategy and how it's taught and how it's written about in business books, and it gets a bit overblown sometimes. You're certainly not guilty of that. And one of the brilliant insights we found in your past writing was SDSS, the first part of which is stop doing stupid stuff, which seems a pretty good instruction. And there's another part to it, which is start doing smart stuff once you've done the first part. So how does that actually work? Because a lot of stupid stuff is built into the corporate structure, its practices that have been going on for 50 years, its rules, its processes. How do you actually stop doing stupid stuff?
Well, my favorite example of this, and this is where that term comes from, is Sharon Price John, the CEO of Airbnb. And here's a fun fact. If you had invested in the year 2000 in Airbnb and invested in equal amount in NVIDIA, right, which is this high-tech darling, you'd be doing better off with the Airbnb stock today than you would have with the NVIDIA stock, even though they're both doing really well. So what Sharon did was she came into Airbnb at a moment when the company was in deep, dark trouble. They had been founded by this entrepreneurial genius, Maxine Clark. And think about this, right? She invented a company where parents pay often north of $100 to provide the free labor that creates her product. Think about that for a minute. And of course, what was actually going on was they were creating experiences. And the company had been generating losses for, I think, 9 quarters by the time Sharon stepped in. And the board had diagnosed the problem being that Maxine had just kind of run out of what she could do as an entrepreneur. And they needed someone with corporate experience and scaling experience and sort of a global viewpoint. And so Sharon came into this incredibly delicate situation, as you can imagine, because Maxine was beloved, still is, by everybody in the company. And I thought Sharon handled it beautifully. So what she did was she made kind of a game out of it. And there were 2 things. She said, well, so you have to stop doing stupid stuff. And that, by the way, is the polite way of saying it. If she would be a little more blunt in person. And she just said to people, make it fun, right? Like if there's stupid stuff going on, let's call it out. Let's give each other feedback. And you know, if we can stop doing stupid things. So as an example, she found, one of her people found that every day there was this report that came out of a printer at one of their locations, and the report kind of was spit out every morning, and nobody knew what to do with it. So it went right from the printer into the recycling bin because somebody like 10 years ago had asked for it, and someone finally was given permission. And this is back to permissionless, right? If you give people permission to stop doing stupid stuff, you would be astonished how much freedom they feel. But a lot of times people feel, oh, you know, we've done it that way forever. I don't want to be the one to rock the boat. I don't want to be the one to cause trouble. And so the permission to say, you know, this is really stupid, let's cut that out. And then Sharon coupled it with what she called drive for a dollar, which the board had said to her upon coming in, that if they could just stop the losses, if they could generate as much as $1 in profit, the bonus pool would be reinstated. And that also became kind of a fun thing. They were like, do you really need to go buy that pencil? No, no, no. And they would self-organize. They would do things like office supply swaps. So if you had a closet full of sticky notes or something that you weren't really using, you brought it at lunchtime to this office supply swap, and somebody that needed them would use them. But it didn't cost the company anything. And so that was a contribution to drive for a dollar. And they made it. And I think what's magical about Sharon is she made it fun.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And when you have the CEO fully behind it, then it's obviously a different world from the CEO, which is frowning on this kind of thing. I'm just wondering to what extent the business schools are part of the problem. When this famous conversation that Eric Schmidt had with Gary Hamel and the Moonshots for Management exercise in 2007, and he, an hour and a half, explained to these world-famous business school professors what this kind of context would be like. And it wasn't just that they didn't approve it. It was the fact that they regarded it as actually dangerous, that if this this kind of thinking were to spread, who knows what catastrophe would happen in the world. And so, in fact, in Gary's report, had 25 ideas, but it did not even mention that one of the ideas was being pursued by this upstart firm that was obviously going nowhere. It was only worth $100 million at the time. And now, of course, 20 years later, it's $4 trillion. To some extent, I get the same reaction from business school professors even today, that this isn't serious. This is not the way work should be done. What can we do about business schools?
That's a very big question. Well, I think there's three things to think about when you think about business schools. The first thing is that business schools, as do many companies, arose out of a particular context. And that was the context of mass production, cheap energy, doing things exactly. And most of business school teaching is around this period when you've got a competitive advantage in place and what you're doing is exploiting it. So practically the whole field of finance is all about that, right? You've got a little bit about entrepreneurship and innovation and maybe a little bit about turnarounds and restructurings, but by and large, it's about you've got an advantage in place, how do you optimize it? So the first, I think, thing to remember about business schools is what they were built for, what they were optimized to do was help people run established businesses. And there's good reasons for that. A lot of business schools were founded in the wake of either the First World War or the Second World War. And the concept was to take people who were used to running military operations and teach them how to be good management stewards. So the purpose was I think, very noble at the time. Secondly, I think the reward systems in business schools derive from academia. And they have come under enormous criticism over the years for not being academic enough. And so if you think about it, the reward system in business schools is all about publishing papers. It's not, did your ideas have impact in the real world? It's did, 10 or 12 or 15 important other academics cite what you wrote. And one of the tragedies of that to me is there are problems that have been solved in business academic research for decades that have not yet made their way into management practice because there's such a gap between what business schools do and talk about and what leaders read and think about. And for example, we know that high commitment, high trust workforces are much more productive, are much more able to deliver good results than low commitment workforces where people are literally, as Jeff Pfeffer would say, dying for a paycheck. We know this. There's absolute rock solid ribbed research on this, and yet has that made its way into management practice? No. So I think the criticism that business schools are not pursuing relevant topics, I think needs to be taken together with the notion that the mechanisms for getting that knowledge into the hands of business people is not very smooth. So that's, I think, a second big issue. And I think the third big issue is that, like any institution, like other university groupings, this is a whole new world. Learning is going to change dramatically. And, these institutions are capable of changing, but there's usually a lag. And so I think what we'll see is business schools will adapt, but it's not going to be overnight. One last thing I would observe about business school academia, if you think about the people who've had a huge impact from academia on business, so I'm thinking of people like Michael Porter, Clayton Christensen, to some extent Gary Hamel, they don't tend to be people who are in the system. They tend to be at the interstices of departments or at the interstices of operations in a traditional business school. So, and Peter Drucker wrote about this decades ago. He said, the average business school is just, writing for each other and they're internally referential. And Drucker had the means to set up his own university, which he did, out in Claremont. And so I think there are ways the system will change, but right now there's a lot that's keeping it stable.
Yeah. Hugo has a question he'd like to ask.
Rita, most companies have been working with small autonomous teams for years. Bezos with 2 pizza rules, Spotify with squads, all of it. And it works at the team level. But the pattern I keep seeing is teams get liberated, the layer above them doesn't. You end up with autonomous-ish. Teams still waiting for a slow center to approve everything. So what actually needs to change about the team for small teams to generally authentically create more value?
Oh, I absolutely believe small teams create more value. One of the things that's happening now is that the unit of value creation is increasingly going to small teams or even individuals. We've had one guy in Israel working by himself created a piece of software that was so enticing that Wix paid $80 million for it. I mean, one guy by himself, 6 months. So the ability to create value is very much going into these distributed teams. And I think this is another reflection of this transition that we're in from a mindset and organizational design built for mass production, copy exactly 1 million widgets of exactly the same thing that we're going to sell. A world of extract from the ground, make something, sell it to a consumer who consumes it, and then it goes in the landfill. That world, right? That's the world we're moving from. And we're moving into a world that's increasingly digital, where services are replacing products, where the unit of value creation is going to be individuals. I would not be surprised if we start to see organizations actually devolving into ecosystems where each set of teams plays a different role. And you can already see early examples of this in very distributed kind of production environments. Certainly in computer hardware, certainly in AI. We've got 70,000 AI companies out there right now, and so I think what will happen is that the teams will be much more the operating model. So one very interesting example that's happening right now is Bayer, 160-year-old company, which makes fertilizers and drugs and stuff like that. And what they've done is they've actually split your career progress into two pieces. So you have your organizational home. So let's say you're a mechanical engineer, right? You have an organizational home in mechanical engineering, and that's where your pay, your promotion, your status, your activity professionally would be determined. Then you have the projects or the assignments to which you are assigned. So the person in charge of those gives you feedback, absolutely evaluation, but they have no control over your career progression. So what that does is it reduces the return on politics to practically zero.
Great. We planning an unusual feature in this podcast. This is the first episode of the podcast, but we planned this as a weekly feature. As you've been listening to the discussion, you have been hearing that there are a number of brilliant ideas around, and there are also examples where managers have been pursuing ideas that are less than brilliant. And so we have a special segment where we invite the speaker to give their selection of one of the less brilliant ideas for the week. So without further ado, Elias, let's hear the worst management idea of the week. Elias? Over to you, Rita.
Well, I think we have an idea that was a good idea at one point and has since become a really dumb idea, which is the idea of bureaucracy. And we all forget that bureaucracy, when it was first introduced, was considered a major scientific advance in management. Before that, it was just the guy that owned the place or ran the place telling people what to do. Once you had bureaucracy, you had specified roles and defined responsibilities and the ability for experts to rise and a reduction in the amount of sheer will that the leader or the owner faced. But one of the ideas in bureaucracy was that you broke each business down into pieces, and then each piece of the business should maximize its own work. And so each piece was rewarded for doing its own thing. And the unfortunate blind spot that creates is it often doesn't ladder up into the whole. So you reward each division, let's say, for doing its own thing and doing its own P&L, but you don't really take into account the enterprise level consequences. So let me give a great example. This is from Sony. And back in the day, Sony owned a movie studio, it owned a gaming platform, it had hardware, it had software, all this stuff. And in the movie studio, they had incredible skill at creating these really memorable characters. And you could imagine a world in which Sony's characters would feed into Sony's gaming business and they would have a real franchise across those businesses. But that's not what happened. What happened at Sony, and it was described actually in a Fortune article called The Civil War inside Sony, each division was rewarded for doing its own thing. And so the movie people maximized their profits by licensing out all the characters to every other game maker quite unintentionally creating competition for Sony's own game business. They didn't all play as one. So maximizing the parts while failing to recognize the consequences for the whole is a really dumb management idea.
Yeah. Nicely done.
Thanks a lot. And back to the serious discussion, Doug has a question about diversity. How do we do better on diversity in organizations? Doug?
Yeah, so operationalizing for diversity, not just in a politically correct sense, but how do you unlock the multiple perspectives and insights of people that come from all different backgrounds and help those cohere into a virtuous whole that's beneficial? How does that work?
I think this is a real leadership challenge because as humans, we know human beings are pre-programmed to talk to, respect, listen to people like themselves. And so by almost biologically, right, we're programmed not to seek out or admit diversity. And so I think there's some leadership practices that you can follow. I'll give a couple of examples. But the first thing I think is leaders need to recognize that this has to happen. So if you're the kind of leader where the way you feel comfortable is people wrap you in bubble wrap and tell you what you want to hear, you're not going to get diversity out of that. You're going to get the same. I think so. Making the conscious decision to do the work of making this happen, I think, is the first necessary condition. Second is you need to institutionalize some practices. So some examples. At Honeywell, when David Cote was the CEO, he would always make it a practice when he traveled around the company. He would always start his meetings to discuss important management issues with the youngest person. And of course, the first few times he did this, the young guy's like, what do I do? Looking at his boss, like, what do I say? And Cody's position was, look, you're a different generation. You're seeing things from a different vantage point than us, 50-year-old something dudes. We really want to know. And he then showed genuine interest and followed through. So picking deliberately in a safe way, picking people who are not normally leading the conversation. I think that's one. A couple of other techniques. There's a technique called the nominal group technique, which is you have a facilitator who asks the question, and everybody, before anybody says anything, everybody writes down their responses to the question and what their best ideas. Then the facilitator collects those responses and then reads them out. So what you've got now is before you've heard what anybody else has said and sort of have the temptation to fall in line, you've now got that richness of ideas to choose from. And it requires facilitation, but it can be done. And then I think the third thing is to really be very proactive about, what's your checklist? Do I have people from different educational backgrounds? Do I have people from different functional backgrounds? Do I have people from different socioeconomic backgrounds? And if the answer is no, then you need to do a little more work to go bring those voices into the room. But I think you have to be proactive about it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
In this section, we've been talking. You've been talking about some really very different ideas from the way traditional management took place in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering whether we could close on the question how big an idea this is. We're seeing, as you saw in Felix Oberholzen's chart, suggesting that maybe 70% of firms are still really stuck in the past with below average returns. And firms that you've been talking about are racing ahead with massively higher returns for everyone, greater value for customers, greater workplaces, and greater value for shareholders. So there's not that they're compromising in one group for another. And yet here we are with, if Felix is right, he'll be talking next week about it. We've got a majority of firms stuck in the past. So is this a paradigm shift in a sort of strict terms? Is this, in fact, not just a set of ideas that, yes, we should explore them, yes, we should work on them, and yes, we try to incorporate them into management? We're talking about something that's beyond management, that is a new discipline that is really a huge change in the way society is being organized. Is that what we're dealing with here?
I absolutely think so. I think we're on the brink of an entirely new paradigm. And as I said, I draw heavily on the work of our mutual friend Carlota Perez, who says, look, we're coming out of this world. And the thing is, nobody who's alive today has ever experienced what came before the industrial, the mass manufacturing, mass production paradigm that was introduced originally by Henry Ford, that has lasted through 2 world wars and post-war global boom. And the assumptions about trade and the Marshall Plan and, that whole set of constructs, which was very successful for a really long time. And it's still with us. The old model is hanging in there and the new model has yet to emerge. And we're right at this turning point. But I believe it's a huge, huge idea.
I agree with that. And I think all 4 of us agree with that. And that's why we've launched this podcast, so that we can explore the depth and breadth of this amazing change that's happening, not just in the US, but in countries around the world. And as I mentioned, Felix Oberhausen will be our next guest next week, and he'll be exploring more of these ideas, showing the quantification of it, and also showing how do we go about implementing this? How do we make this practical? As these are different ways of thinking, different ways of speaking, different ways of acting, different ways of interacting. This is not just something you do one morning. You have a 2-hour workshop and suddenly you're in a new mode. This is deep and fundamental. And so the series will be looking at how different speakers have written about this, how they have explored the many different examples of firms that are actually in this mode. And we hope that this weekly event will be something that people will look forward to get continuing inspiration about how they can move into this mode too. And if you've been putting questions in the question box for this session, we'll be following up on those and giving answers to them. And during the week, we'll be able to have further discussions as to how this is taking place. So we've had fun with Rita today, and we'll hope to have fun with all of you over the coming weeks as we explore the amazing range of this set of ideas. So thanks, Rita, and thanks to my co-host. Look forward to being with you again next week at the same time, Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern.
Thanks, Rita.
Thanks, Rita.
Pleasure to be here.
You again.
Thanks.